Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend, the Asia editor for The Times. Richard Lloyd Parry has been in Japan for, I think, nearly 26 years, initially with The Independent and now with The Times. And as it happens, Richard and I actually met on a boat to North Korea almost 25 years ago, in 1996. We were on a ship out of Niigata, Japan, called the Shin Sakura Maru, attending a UNDP, a UN Development Program organized conference in Najin Sunbong on the borders between North Korea, China, and Russia up there. A fascinating experience. Richard, it's so good to see you again.
Very good to see you, Gordon. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I'll have to tell our audience here that as somebody who is not at all sports minded, I also do remember that the best basketball game in my life was on board that ship with you. And that's just because I am so bad at basketball, because everybody else, yourself included, who were good at shooting would shoot at the basket, which was moving on the waves, and they would miss. But me, who was just throwing up bricks, would shoot and the basket would move to the ball. And so it's my best game ever. I was still bad, but it was good. So
I'm very glad you're impressed by my play. I have to admit that was the first and only time I've ever played basketball.
Well, the fact that you were still better than me tells you everything you need to know. Look, Richard, you're obviously best known for your journalism, but not just that, your incredible research. I count among the most impressive books that I've read in the last decade, your book, Ghosts of the Tsunami. For those of you who don't know, Richard was among the first on the ground after the horrific events over a decade ago, after the tsunami, earthquake rather, tsunami, and then a nuclear disaster up in the northeastern part of Japan, and went and over the course of a long period of time profiled a particular town and the impact of those horrific events on the citizens of that town. It's probably among the most moving books that I've ever read and the most insightful. So Richard, give us just a second. Do you mind? I presume the book is still on sale and available. To give a brief recap of Ghosts of the Tsunami. And then if you might, where do we stand a decade after your first visits up there to the northeast of Japan?
Sure, yes. Well, Ghosts of the Tsunami is really tells two stories. One is the story of a primary school in northeast Japan, Okawa School, which was almost unique in suffering a terrible tragedy. Most kids who are in schools were immediately evacuated. They were perfectly safe. This one school, the teachers, for mysterious reasons, didn't evacuate, although they could have done. The wave came in and almost everyone at the school, including over 70 children, died. And that was a tragedy, but it also became a mystery. The question was why that had happened. The other part of the book, and the two sort of overlap, was that after about 6 months, people in that part of Japan started seeing ghosts, unconnected to one another, all over, different kinds of spooky stories, mysterious stories. There were cases of people who were possessed by spirits of people who died in the tsunami. And that connects very much with the folklore of that part of Japan. So I tell those two stories in the book, and it's a way of trying to convey through a small lens the broader tragedy. And as for how things are now, I was there just before the 10th anniversary in March, and physically, the place is completely back to normal, almost completely. If you didn't know there'd been a terrible disaster there, you would never guess from the evidence of your senses. All the mess has been cleared up. There's a few sort of empty lots, but you wouldn't know why they're empty. Psychologically, however, people are still really suffering. And a lot of those mental wounds are still as raw as they were a few months after the disaster.
Well, thank you for the recap. I appreciate the effort that you put into chronicling and telling the story of those families, those parents, that town. Again, as somebody who'd been to that region numerous times before the tsunami and actually visited the Fukushima plant afterwards, I found it, again, among the most moving books I've ever read and the most insightful in terms of that. Thank you for doing it. And for those of you watching this, it's available still. Just look up Richard's name, Ghosts of the Tsunami. You'll thank me for recommending this book. Richard, let's turn to kind of current events right now. Australia is a sports mad nation, and we're very much focused on the Olympics, which are coming days away. And yet we're also at the same time focused on COVID-19, and these two stories are colliding together. Can you give us a sense for what's happening right now? We're just days away from it was supposed to be the commencement opening the Olympics. It looks like it's going ahead, but without an audience. Give us your take on the Olympics in Japan.
Yeah, it is clearly going to go ahead now, or at least Olympic-themed sporting events will be happening in the 2 weeks beginning next week. The opening ceremony is next Friday, 23rd of July. But it's going to be an Olympics unlike any other. As you say, there'll be no spectators at all. We knew there were not going to be any foreign spectators allowed. Now they've officially decided there won't be any Japanese spectators either. Just a handful at some events outside Tokyo, but none in Tokyo at all. So that's going to make a big difference. The conditions imposed, the necessities imposed by the pandemic, of course, are very strict. Everyone who comes in, athletes, journalists, officials, has to be confined to what they call a bubble in an effort to prevent infection spreading. That's causing, at the very least, a lot of bureaucracy. But I think the biggest factor in all this is that time after time, when they're asked in opinion polls, Japanese people say they just don't want these games to happen. This hasn't manifested itself in an angry way. Japan's political culture isn't really like that. There have been a handful of demonstrations, but only a few dozen, at most a few score people. But when you talk to people, the last opinion poll I saw showed that 78% people didn't want the games to happen, only 22% do. And that's reflected in conversations you have. People are really, some are kind of resigned to it and feel weary about it. Others are really angry that this is being imposed on them by their government. The world's biggest sporting event in the world's most densely populated city, the world's biggest city, during the world's worst ever modern pandemic. To a lot of people, that is an absurdity.
I think there's probably some hope on the part of the organizers and actually the participants that once the actual games get afoot, that we will focus actually on the sports themselves and the excellence of the individual participants, and that will help set the context. But you're right. What a difficult environment. You mentioned that the Japanese public wasn't responding in an angry way. You can imagine how the situation would be playing out in the UK, here in Australia, back in the United States. But obviously politics is overlaid with this. This was intended to be last year kind of the crowning achievement of Prime Minister Abe's long tenure as Prime Minister. It now seems like it's a bit of a poison chalice for Prime Minister Suga. Can you help us understand the domestic political implications of the Olympics?
Yes, I mean, before this pandemic, the Olympics were looking like a political gift to the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party. I mean, Japanese people love these big international events, and they're such fun when they happen here. I mean, I've covered, among others, the Rugby World Cup in 2019 and the Soccer World Cup in 2002, and they were such fun. The atmosphere was great. And even Japanese people who didn't understand anything about rugby, which is quite a lot of them, really got into it. And it was a magical atmosphere. And the Japanese government was looking forward to that. Japan often does pretty well in the games. They get a good share of medals. They would have had the home crowd cheering them on. It would have been great. And it would have been timed beautifully for an election to the leadership of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. The holder of that job currently automatically becomes Prime Minister because they have a majority, and then followed by a general election in the autumn. So you can see how they had it all worked out. Olympic feel-good boost, and then bang, bang, party election, general election. Of course, it's all been thrown into doubt now. Mr. Suga, I think there's general agreement, has been a bit of a disappointment. He he makes Shinzo Abe look charismatic by comparison, and Shinzo Abe was not a man most people would describe as charismatic. But he has been in this terribly difficult position. I mean, he must have been asking himself, just in raw political terms, what's the best calculation here? Obviously, cancelling an Olympics and taking the huge financial hit that would bring, apart from the kind of emotional letdown, is not something a politician wants to do. But it's been clear for several months now that pressing on with the Olympics is terribly unpopular. So what do? He made the decision to go ahead. It's a huge gamble. At best, I think he can hope that the Olympics will be a great TV event, as you said. Perhaps spirits will rise once they're underway, and he'll hope that the restrictions, the tough measures, limits on movement and so on, will contain any viral outbreaks. But none of that is guaranteed. So Mr. Suga's political fate is really one that you can't predict more than perhaps a week or two ahead.
Look, none of this is a game, but there really is a race between kind of the narratives we were talking about, positive, the excellence of sport, the video spectacle, and just the fear of the new Delta variant of COVID-19 and the impact on that. There's just a lot of issues playing out there, and I think you're probably right. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but we'll be watching for both good and otherwise. Can we talk a little bit more broadly about COVID in Japan? Early on, Japan was kind of held up with countries like Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, as have handling it relatively well. Mask wearing culture had done well. All of a sudden now we're in a very different spot. Even countries like Australia, which had early success in suppressing the virus, now having difficulties in vaccination kind of things. Can you just give a sense for both domestically how Japan is handling COVID, and then more importantly, what that means for Japan's role in the region?
Yeah, I mean, throughout all of last year, I felt very lucky to be living in Tokyo. I think of all the world's mega cities, this was the best one to be in. The rates of infection were low. It was rather hard to work out why. The government has done a particularly good job. I think a lot of it came down to the fact that most Japanese people naturally do the things that are good to do in a pandemic. So standards of hygiene are very high. People wash their hands anyway. They're quite used to wearing masks anyway during the winter because of colds, flu, and spring pollen allergies. So everyone wears masks. There's no debate about that. And the directives from the government, which were never mandatory, there's never been a mandatory lockdown here, strong recommendations from the government tend to be treated as with the force of mandatory demands. People do as they're told when they get sensible advice from the government. So that all helped. And I felt sorry for my friends, family members back in Europe, people in North America, where it was so much worse. I mean, it's still the case that the numbers here have not run out of control. I mean, it's nothing like as bad even now as it was last year in Western Europe, North America. But it is worse, getting worse. And that sense that East Asia is ahead of the West has gone now. There are various reasons for it. The main one is vaccinations. For rather complicated reasons, vaccination rollout has been very slow in those countries, and certainly in Japan. The biggest reason, I think, is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy fueled by vaccine hesitancy among the general population. So the Japanese authorities were reluctant to rush through approvals as they did in the West, because they sensed, I think rightly, that a lot of people here would feel uneasy with that. So Japan suddenly feels behind. I mean, the fifth wave, the fifth tick up on the graph, is now bearing down on us in Japan, just as the Olympics are about to begin. As for what this means for Japan regionally, I suppose it means that Japan's going to be behind other countries in firing up its economy again, in re-engaging with the rest of the world. I mean, I'm stuck here, not because I can't travel back to the UK, because soon I will be able to do that with relative ease, easier than it was, but because coming back into Japan, I'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks, and my kids couldn't go to school and so on. So it is, you know, it does make a difference in the real world. And the big question, going back to that subject, is what's going to happen with these Olympics and what effect that will have on the infection rates.
Oh, fantastic. I recall, I think my first trip to Japan, I was struck that as you went to the airport in Narita, the old terminal, there was a big sign that said, enjoy your stay in Japan, but please obey the rules. And I think that culture has actually served Japan well, although you're I think, quite insightful in identifying the new challenges in the current environment. Let's move a little bit more broadly from just COVID to kind of Japan's role in the region. I think the last time I saw you in person was at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, but that's been now 3 years. The last two have unfortunately been canceled, the last one at the last minute. Can you just give us a sense for Japan's position in the world? A lot changed under Prime Minister Abe. There's been a lot of attention this week about Japan's new defense white paper, particularly that really cool painting on the front. And those of you who are watching this who want to see some beautiful art, there's a samurai astride a horse in a beautiful Japanese art that makes it the most beautiful defense white paper I've ever seen in my life in any country in the world. But that obviously, in statements about Japan's relationship with Taiwan, have raised a lot of questions about Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. Can you give us a sense for shifts that are taking place inside Japan on that issue?
Yeah, various shifts are taking place. Just in the last few months, I mean, I think really this year, probably since the advent of the Biden administration, there's a very noticeable shift has taken place essentially in Japan's public articulations vis-a-vis China. Of course, it's all about China and the way that countries in this region are going to live, get along with, not get along with an ever more powerful and assertive China. And in recent months, the Japanese government has been more and more assertive. I mean, the context of all this is that the Liberal Democratic Party, which with a few years exception, has essentially ruled Japan since the 1950s, has always had two kind of broad factions, streams of thought. One very suspicious of China, but one very pro-China. A lot of old LDP politicians had strong links with Beijing and with the CCP, which had been maintained over many years. Recently, the initiative has very much gone to the first group, to the anti-China, if you can call it that, faction. In the old days, in these white papers, for example, that they were so mealy-mouthed. I mean, Japan would talk in general about sort of challenges. They might very occasionally use the word threats. They would talk about the threat of North Korea, but they would never use that of China. They avoided that kind of language because they didn't want to provoke, because China is a huge trading partner for Japan. And they were very aware of their position, their unavoidable position as China's neighbor. You know, to some extent, they felt they had to get on with China. That's really changed. In I think the last few months, last year, they're not afraid now to talk. You know, as you were saying about the dangers of Chinese menaces towards Taiwan, for example. They talk about the threat there. They're very upset about the way that China routinely now sends its patrol ships, Coast Guard ships, around the Senkaku Islands, which are administered by Japan but claimed by China as the Diaoyu Islands, and the way in which the PLA Navy is using the straits between the Japanese islands as transit points for sailing submarines, even aircraft carriers, naval ships out into the broader Pacific. It's allowed to do that. These are international waters. But when the Japanese see a Chinese aircraft carrier and a carrier fleet chugging between their islands, they naturally get a very funny feeling. And now they're talking about that and complaining vocally.
You've mentioned the Biden administration, and also many of the issues you just discussed obviously have direct relevance to Japan's long-standing security alliance with the United States. Japan probably weathered the Trump era as well as any other country. There was that famous kind of bromance between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump, and hats and golf courses and hamburgers and the like. Yet it was a difficult time. Since Biden has come in, you've had a leaders meeting virtual summit of the Quad. Could you just give us a little bit of a sense for how Japan is viewing the Biden administration thus far?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like many people, they're extremely relieved to see the back of Donald Trump. Although, as you say, Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister, handled him very well. I mean, he flew out to Trump Tower. Yeah. Even before the inauguration. The votes had hardly been counted before he was flying out and presenting him with gold golf clubs and things like that. And at the time, it looked so undignified, this sucking up to Donald Trump. But actually, over the term of the administration, I think it did serve Japan very well. Abe handled Trump fine. He flattered him and told him what he wanted to hear. And Trump didn't mess around or tinker with any of the things he threatened to, like the US-Japan alliance, stationing of US troops in Japan. So it was all fine. Still, they're glad to have Biden around. He's much more like a kind of normal US president they're used to dealing with. I have to say, I mean, I don't, closely track Washington politics and foreign policy and so on, but I don't think Biden's made a particularly strong impression in Asia so far. The shifts, as I was saying, that I've noticed and been surprised by have been in Japanese utterance. What people in this part of the world are looking for from Biden is a strong policy on North Korea. There isn't really one. I mean, Biden North Korea policy is very hard to pin down or define. It seems to be sort of Obama light, very watery, no clear direction there. And as far as the other things go, people like Antony Blinken, Austin Lloyd, the defense secretary, have made visits and said the right things. They basically reasserted the sort of existing status quo before Trump, and be very supportive about Japan. But it slightly reminds me of the Obama administration, where Obama, as everyone remembers, came in. And this pivot to Asia was announced. It seemed like a very new direction in US foreign policy. But then nothing very dramatic changed because he got bogged down in the Middle East, as so many US leaders do. So, I'm not an expert on US foreign policy, but I can't say it's made a big difference so far.
One of the impacts of the Trump era was that it pushed countries like Japan and Australia to look for strengthened relationships elsewhere. And so the Australia-Japan relationship, the Japan-India relationship, the Australia-India relationship have all developed dramatically over the last 5 years. And I presume that trend is continuing, potentially one benefit of that era. Hey, look, in an era where the business model around newspapers is struggling, we in Australia have seen a remarkable diminution of reporters on the ground. Issues like COVID have limited the ability to travel. Countries like China have kicked out a large number of our reporters. And it all highlights how fortunate we are to have somebody with your depth of experience reporting from Japan to help us understand a country that is so important, not just to Australia, but to the Indo-Pacific and the world. Richard, thank you so much for your time and for your insights today. And I look forward to the time when I can get back up to Tokyo again soon.
Thanks very much, Gordon. We must go to North Korea again soon as well.
Not sure how that gets on the schedule. It does seem like North Korea is in for a world of hurt right now, as they've announced that they've got a grave situation developing there, which only gives you thoughts of the horrors that might be taking place behind closed doors in a country that has a weakened healthcare system. And no vaccines at all that we know of. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gordon. It's a pleasure.